Kathy Martin was born on October 25, 1959, in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a loving household and had an extremely close relationship with her sister. During her high school years, Kathy met a boy named Mike, and a few years later the two of them got married. The pair settled in a calm suburb of Houston, and soon after their wedding they welcomed a daughter. 3 years after that, Kathy became pregnant again, and in early 1987 they had a son. By then, Kathy was 27 years old. After her second child was born, she spent all her time at home taking care of the kids. Mike worked at a small sign factory that belonged to Kathy's father, and the family earned enough to provide for their children. Kathy's parents also helped them financially, allowing her to dedicate all her time to raising the kids. On March 3, 1987, Kathy was at home with her children as usual, while Mike was at his job. Once his shift ended, he chose to meet up with some friends and went to a bar. Mike called his wife from a payphone, but she did not answer. This was strange since Kathy almost never had the opportunity to leave the house, not even briefly. Mike tried phoning her several additional times, but still could not get through. Feeling uneasy, he contacted their neighbor, Tim, and asked him to check on Kathy. Tim went to their house and knocked on the door, but no one responded. When he looked through the living room window, he saw that the TV was on, so he continued knocking, but still received no reply. Tim started to fear that something might have happened to Kathy. Instead of returning home to call Mike or the police, he got into his car and drove around town looking for patrol officers. After a few minutes of driving, he saw a police car and told the officers what was happening, asking them to go check on Kathy. When the police arrived at the house and got no response to their knocking, they tried the door handle and discovered it was unlocked. Once inside, they immediately found Kathy's daughter on the living room sofa. She was unconscious, showing obvious signs of trauma, but she was still alive. The officers quickly requested an ambulance and continued searching the other rooms. In the bedroom, they found the younger child in his crib, unharmed. But in another room, they came upon a horrifying scene. Kathy was lying on the floor, covered in blood. She was naked, and the police instantly recognized that she was dead. Her hands had also been bound with a lamp cord. The paramedics transported Kathy's daughter to the hospital, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. Shortly afterward, Kathy's father arrived at the house, but the police did not reveal all the specifics of what had taken place. Instead, they instructed him to go to the hospital so he could be with his granddaughter when she regained consciousness. He agreed, and while he waited at the hospital, he learned about his daughter's death from a news report on the television. Meanwhile, Mike arrived at the house, and the police immediately noticed something unusual. Aside from the fact that he showed up quite late, there were several marks on his shirt that looked like blood. The police told him to hand over his clothing and answer their questions. At the same time, the investigators made several significant discoveries. First, they found numerous blood stains in the bathroom, indicating that the perpetrator had attempted to wash away the crime scene. This suggested that the attacker had stayed in the house for some time rather than leaving right after the murder. Second, the forensic specialists detected no signs of forced entry. Every window and door, except the front door, was locked. This indicated that Kathy had either voluntarily allowed the attacker inside or the person had a key. The police also noticed another detail. All of Kathy's clothing had been neatly placed on the floor next to her body. This not only pointed to the likelihood of sexual assault, but also made it unusual that the attacker had folded her clothes so carefully. The detectives speculated that the assailant might have threatened to harm her children if she screamed or refused to obey his demands. Kathy might have agreed to comply with whatever they ordered, only to be killed afterward. Meanwhile, the medics were working to save Kathy's daughter. They determined that she had been viciously beaten, most likely with bare hands. After several hours in the hospital, she slipped into a coma, and her chances of survival remained low. Medical specialists examined Kathy's body and concluded that she had suffered 16 stab wounds, mostly in the abdominal area. They also verified that she had been sexually assaulted and collected biological material from the attacker. However, at that time, DNA analysis was not yet widely used in forensic investigations, so the specialists could not extract a DNA profile from the semen. The most they could do was identify the perpetrator's blood type, so the biological evidence was sent to a laboratory. From the earliest stages of the investigation, the police began directing their attention toward the victim's husband. After noticing the suspicious marks on his shirt, they submitted his clothing for testing. Mike's behavior that night also raised concerns. After finishing work, he went out with friends, but instead of going home himself when he could not reach his wife, he instructed a neighbor to go check on her. Detectives had encountered similar tactics before, in cases where a husband committed the murder and created an alibi by going out with others. Then he would have someone else discover his wife to avoid being the one who found the body and divert suspicion away from himself. Mike's involvement would also match the absence of forced entry. Investigators started looking into whether he might have had the opportunity to commit the murder before meeting his friends. The detectives soon came across something else. Mike had a criminal history. Right after high school, he had been arrested for selling drugs to an undercover officer. He was given a 6-year prison sentence but served only 2 before being released on parole. Not long after that, he married Kathy. But despite this information, the police still needed more concrete evidence to charge him. They also began examining the neighbor, Tim, whose actions seemed questionable. Instead of calling the police from his home, he drove around the city attempting to find patrol officers. The detectives also searched Tim's car and found something notable. There were suspicious marks on the floor mats that looked like blood, so they were also sent to the laboratory. Investigators began wondering whether Mike and Tim might have committed the crime together or whether one of them had acted alone. Meanwhile, the medical specialists concluded their assessment and reached an interesting finding. They determined that Kathy had died around 1 p.m., roughly 6 hours before she was discovered. This meant the detectives now needed to investigate where the suspects had been long before the evening and what they had done after the murder. Mike and Tim both insisted they had been at work, so the police began verifying their alibis. Meanwhile, 2 days after the murder, they received a call from the hospital. Kathy's daughter had unexpectedly come out of her coma. Her life was no longer in danger, and investigators went to speak with her, hoping she could provide information about what had occurred. But they soon encountered an obstacle. The girl, who was only 4 years old at the time, had nearly lost all memory of that day. All she could recall was a man with light-colored hair entering their house. Both her father and Tim had dark hair, but the detectives did not hurry to eliminate them as suspects. They considered the possibility that the girl's memory might be distorted because of the severe trauma she had suffered. They consulted psychologists and asked them to work with the girl, hoping she might remember more details about the attacker. The detectives soon received a call from the laboratory, and there was another surprising development. The experts tested the samples from the 2 suspects and learned that the stains on the neighbor's floor mats were machine oil, and the stains on the husband's shirt were simply paint. But that was not all. Numerous coworkers of Mike and Tim, who worked at different workplaces, confirmed that they had been on the job all day and had not left until the evening. This meant neither man had the opportunity to be at Kathy's house and commit the crime. Detectives asked both men to undergo polygraph examinations, and the results showed no signs of deception in either case. The police, who had been almost certain that at least one of the 2 men was involved, found themselves back at the beginning. They started considering other possible suspects who knew the victim and could have entered her home easily. Detectives spoke with Kathy's relatives and friends, asking who they believed might have committed the crime, and soon they came across something unexpected. Many of them, without hesitation, mentioned the same person, Greg. Greg was Kathy's brother-in-law, and her family members revealed that she had often complained about his behavior. According to Kathy, Greg openly flirted with her and had repeatedly tried to persuade her to engage in intimate activity with him. Kathy also mentioned that Greg frequently made inappropriate comments about her abdomen, and, as known, most of the stab wounds were located in that area. The police also learned that Greg regularly used illegal drugs and had a criminal background. Detectives began focusing their attention on him and soon encountered their first potential clue. Forensic specialists found a fingerprint in Kathy's home that matched Greg's, along with a strand of hair that resembled his. However, there was a complication. Since Greg often visited Kathy and her husband, the fingerprint and the hair might have been left there before the murder. Kathy's parents said that they believed he was responsible. Her mother also shared an unusual observation. While she was at the hospital with her granddaughter, Greg arrived to see them in the middle of the night. As soon as the girl saw him, she looked at her grandmother, and judging by her expression, she seemed extremely frightened. After Greg left, the grandmother asked if he was the man who had come to their house, but the girl said she still could not remember. After hearing all of this, the detectives summoned Greg for questioning. He denied having anything to do with the murder and said he had been with a friend at the time, a friend who also had a lengthy criminal history. During the interrogation, Greg said he needed to go to the parking lot to extend his meter time to avoid getting a ticket. However, he never returned to the station. His wife, Kathy's sister, stated that on that day, Greg had dropped her off at work around 10:30 in the morning and had picked her up at 2:30 p.m. Thus, he had a 4-hour window that aligned with the time of the murder, giving him the chance to kill Kathy. But despite all of this, the police had no solid evidence that directly connected him to the crime. As a final option, they decided to test the semen sample taken from the victim's body. But at that time, specialists could only determine the owner's blood type. It would also require a large portion of the sample, and after performing such a test, very little biological material would remain for any further analysis. Even so, the detectives chose to have the test conducted, and the blood type of the sample's owner from Kathy's body matched Greg's blood type. However, this result still did not prove his guilt, so the investigators could not arrest him. They continued searching for other evidence, but they were unable to establish Greg's involvement. Eventually, the case reached a dead end. Kathy's family was convinced that Greg was the killer, but they were powerless to change anything. Shelley, Kathy's sister, refused to accept that her husband was responsible and continued living with him. Over the following years, detectives occasionally reviewed the case, hoping to uncover new details. In 1998, 11 years after the murder, they requested DNA testing on the remaining semen sample. But they encountered another problem. Specialists could extract only a partial DNA profile, which, when compared with Greg's DNA sample, resulted in an inconclusive match. The analysis showed that Greg belonged to the 2% of the population that could match the partial profile. Unable to arrest him based solely on this finding, detectives once again called Greg in for questioning, informing him that the semen from the victim's body matched his DNA. To their surprise, Greg changed his original statement, claiming that he had a consensual relationship with Kathy and had indeed visited her on the day of the murder, though he insisted she had still been alive when he left. Detectives were, of course, skeptical of Greg's sudden alteration in story. Such shifts are quite common in homicide cases when suspects hear about DNA matches. Additionally, Kathy had complained about Greg's advances and had felt uncomfortable around him, making it highly unlikely that she would have engaged in a secret affair with him. But despite their suspicions, the detectives realized they could not obtain a conviction without a complete DNA match. The local prosecutors reviewed the case and confirmed that achieving a guilty verdict would be nearly impossible, and once again, the case went cold for several more years. In 2002, detectives reopened the investigation and sought assistance from forensic scientist Catherine Long, who was conducting groundbreaking DNA research at the time. She and her team wanted to determine whether genetic material from a perpetrator's hands could remain on a victim's body after strangulation, and whether it could be collected for testing. To explore this, Catherine and her colleagues simulated strangulation by squeezing one another's necks, then gathered samples from their hands and from the neck area. The results were quite notable. Even brief contact left enough skin particles for DNA testing. The detectives working on Kathy's case became interested in their experiment, even though the victim had not been strangled. Re-examining her body years later was also impossible. Instead, they began reviewing all the available evidence to determine whether the perpetrator might have touched any other items. Their focus soon shifted to the lamp cord that had been used to bind Kathy's hands. It was clear that only the killer could have tightened it, since the victim could not have done it herself. The detectives gave the cord to Catherine, who, along with her colleagues, began analyzing it. They first noticed an important detail. The cord had been stored in a paper bag, which allowed air to circulate and prevented moisture from accumulating, something that could have damaged biological samples. Experts collected swabs from the entire length of the cord, including sections where traces of Kathy's blood remained. After performing their analysis, they identified 2 DNA profiles. The first one, belonging to the victim, was expected. But the second profile matched Greg's DNA sample perfectly. That meant the detectives had finally obtained solid evidence that Greg was the one who tied Kathy's hands and, therefore, that he was the killer. Shortly afterward, 15 years after the murder, the man was finally arrested. During questioning, he refused to confess, insisting that he had a romantic relationship with Kathy. The detectives clearly did not believe him and, armed with the DNA evidence, decided to take the case to court. While awaiting trial, he was held in prison. Some time later, the detectives received a significant phone call. His cellmate contacted them, claiming that Greg had confessed to him. According to the cellmate, Greg boasted about assaulting and murdering his wife's sister in detail. He said that on the day of the crime, Greg took illegal substances and went to Kathy's home. Once inside, he tried to force her into an intimate encounter, but she resisted and demanded that he leave. Greg then approached her daughter and struck the child several times with great force. After that, he told Kathy that if she did not comply with everything he wanted, he would kill her son. Kathy, having no other choice, agreed in order to protect her children. Greg restrained her, assaulted her, and killed her, inflicting multiple stab wounds. He then rinsed the blood off himself in the bathroom and changed into her husband's clothing to avoid getting blood inside his own car. The detectives had no doubt about the accuracy of the cellmate's account, as he could not have known so many crucial details even if he had seen news coverage of the case. Armed with the cellmate's statement, the detectives confronted Greg, and this time he finally confessed. He admitted that he had killed Kathy and repeated everything he had told his cellmate. In 2004, he pleaded guilty before the judge and received a 45-year prison sentence. However, he served only 4 years and died from liver cancer at the age of 56. Kathy's husband, Mike, did not live long enough to learn of the killer's arrest. He died at the age of 45. Kathy's children and parents thanked the detectives for resolving the case, even though it took 15 years. Throughout all that time, they had been nearly certain that Greg was the killer and had to watch him continue living with their second daughter, yet they had been unable to do anything about it. If you found this case intriguing, make sure to like and subscribe. We upload new crime case videos every night. Stay tuned and brace yourself for what's coming next.